Pails and rails for hip extension. So you're gonna line up here in this split kneeling position. And what I'm looking for is a stretch of this tissue here in the front. Now you might have already found it from just being here, but if not, you can play around with this position of the pelvis. I like to scoop the pelvis up, so imagine the belt buckle going up towards my face to create that stretch here. Yo, what's up? I'm Coach Rich Thurman, also known as Coach RT3, and today we're going to talk about some things that you can do as a runner to help your hip mobility. Before we get started, make sure you smash the subscribe button so you never miss a post from me again. All right, so the very first thing I like to prescribe for my clients is hip cars. I think hip cars is a great entry point for helping people understand what their hips are capable of. And so it just takes your hip through its fullest range of available motion, and that gives your hips and all your tissues surrounding the hip joint an ability to be nourished, get the tissue and the nervous system aware of the space available, and just helps you understand the overall fundamental movements of your hips. Check out this video as I show you how to do hip cars, and you can start integrating that into your training. All right, the very first thing we have to understand is that running is a very linear sport. So in that sport, the hips are required to go into flexion and some degree of extension over and over and over again. And so our hips become more efficient and more accommodated at doing that motion. The hip, although it can do that motion, that's not its fundamental objective. The hip's objective is a lot of different variable movements. And the hip joint is a ball and socket, so the ball and socket needs to rotate in that joint, and it needs to rotate well in order for you to have a healthy joint. I always believe that the worst posture is the posture you spend the most time in. And so it's not about one good posture or one bad posture, it's about what posture do I spend the vast majority of my time in, and how do I supplement that with other things in order to help improve my overall life. The very first thing I say is do hip cars. Why? Because hip cars provide the fundamental movement of the joint, which is rotation. It takes it through all the variable movements of the hip joint. So it gives the joint nourishment and it allows the bone to move freely or within the ranges that you have available. A hip car looks like this. We start out standing nice and tall. I'm going to bring the leg across into adduction. So I'm trying to squeeze here. I'm going to scoop into external rotation. I'm going to take as much external rotation as I can as I move through flexion. Once I run out of room in external rotation and flexion, I'm going to begin to move out of external rotation and scoop in a little bit more flexion. I'm going to move out into abduction, so moving and opening the gate. Once I can no longer open the gate any further than that, I'm going to change positions here. I'm going to begin to internally rotate. So I'm trying to find as much internal rotation as I have there without dumping through the hips here. So I'm internally rotating, moving my hip through its fullest range of motion. I'm sneaking out some extension here. I got to create a little bit more space here because of the bar. And I'm sneaking out a little bit of extension through there as I bring the leg back to join the other knee. Once I join the other knee, I'm going to move back into extension, which we have very little of, so squeezing this stuff here. And then I'm going to begin to abduct, so bringing the leg away from the midline. And then I'm going to externally rotate. So I'm externally rotating back up into that flexion. Okay, now that I'm in that flexion, I'm going to bring my leg back across, sneak out some more external rotation, adduct, so I'm squeezing that together, and back down. So I teach my clients to move through that on a regular basis, daily, pre-run, post-run, all of that, because we want to remind the body of its fundamental movements. We want to remind the nervous system what the fundamental movement of your joint is. It's not to cycle, it's not to run, it's not to do all of those linear things that we like doing. It's to move freely through rotation. Add that to your daily routine, add that to your pre and post training, and just sprinkle it in throughout the rest of your life and watch how things change. So hip cars, as I said, is a very good entry point for training your hip, getting started with nourishing the hip and beginning your hip mobility journey. The very next thing that I'm going to have you do is check out hip extension. Now, as we run, typically we don't move through our fullest range of hip motion in flexion and extension. And this just gives us an opportunity to work in that end range of hip extension that we may not be accessing throughout the volume of running that we do. And so as we begin to do more and more running, we begin to accommodate and build in the mobility and the strength within a small window of range. I want to take you out of that range and get you into a deeper stretch and get your hips more awareness of that space that you should have available, not only as a runner, but just as someone who wants to move through life more efficiently and effectively. Check out this video as I show you how to do hip extension and get a little bit more mobility out of the end range of that movement. Pails and rails for hip extension. So you're gonna line up here in this split kneeling position. And what I'm looking for is a stretch of this tissue here in the front. Now you might have already found it from just being here, but if not, you can play around with this position of the pelvis. I like to scoop the pelvis up, so imagine the belt buckle going up towards my face to create that stretch here. And then I'll lean slightly forward to get a little bit deeper into it. I'll hold that stretch for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'm gonna drive the knee down and forward, trying to activate this stuff here as if I was trying to kick my leg through. And then my rails contraction is going to be pulling back, squeezing this stuff back here to try and drag this bone backwards. Okay, so Pails contraction is driving down and forward to contract this tissue here, ramping up slowly over time to your maximal effort. And then your rails contraction is pulling back, squeezing this stuff here. So we've created a little bit more range in hip extension. We've been able to access that tissue and we've showed you how to create that. But what about hip flexion? As we run, oftentimes we may not move into our full range of hip flexion. Unless we're a sprinter, we're not actually lifting our knee up and getting that full hip range of motion. And so we're accommodating to running through a very small window, at least most of us are, running through a very small window of motion for our knee joint. So we may not be moving through a full high stride of that knee as we're running unless we're doing sprints. So our runs may have our hip going through this constant motion all over and over again. And since we're not accessing that full range, we begin to accommodate, or our body begins to prefer that range of motion. So I want to take you out of that range of motion, have you move into a deeper range of hip flexion, and help you understand that we can access a broader range of that motion, and we can train that tissue as well. Check out this video as I show you how to move into end range hip flexion and how to train that isometrically in this. Pails and rails for bent knee hip flexion. So we're going to start here in bent knee hip flexion. What I'm going to do is look for a stretch of this tissue back here behind me. So I'm going to take my hips and I'm going to shift so that I'm going to shift in this direction, pelvis and belt buckle facing down towards the ground, in order to find a stretch of this tissue. Once I've found that stretch of that tissue, I'm going to hang out for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'm going to begin to drive down into the box, making the foot heavy by using this stuff here. Once I ramp up to my maximal effort, I'm going to reverse that for my rails contraction, which is pulling this bone closer to my abdomen for that rails contraction. So Pails contraction is driving down, ramping up this stuff. Rails contraction is pulling closer to me, trying to make the foot light on the box. So that was hip flexion, looking at your end range of hip flexion and learning how to contract and create force in that space. That's a great way to help your body understand that this range should be available to you as well. And not forget to train that space as we produce a lot of volume in those other ranges, but we don't typically place a lot of emphasis on creating volume in that later range or that later window of range of motion. Hopefully this video shed some insight and help you understand a little bit more about what your hips are capable of and what you can be doing to help improve your overall broad range of motion. And if this video helped you, please be sure to share it with a friend who runs. Be sure to smash the subscribe button so you never miss a post from me again. And make sure you like this video so that it does all the things it's supposed to do for the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching.